This is really an exciting occasion, and I will talk about how Western aesthetics made modern Chinese literature more political. I'm going to argue that a narrow and truncated version of aesthetics in a Chinese reception of that Western import. Chinese have been reading, absorbing Western aesthetic ideas and theory for more than a century. Now, this narrow aesthetics encouraged the pursuit of aesthetic qualities encapsulated in the idea of literariness. Now, literariness isolates a set of inner qualities or certain linguistic, generic, and structural features of a work. And these aesthetic features are believed to embody autonomy and freedom. I'll give you an example. It's sort of a typical example. In an article on Liang Qichao, on Liang Qichao, C.T. Xia is a Columbia professor, pioneer in modern Chinese literary criticism. C.T. Xia takes issue with Liang Qichao's call for a new fiction that would renovate the morality of the readers, referring to Liang's well-known essay, Fiction in Relation to the Governance of People. Xia complains that by investing the new fiction with a didactic mission in the service of national politics, Liang is actually following the traditional doctrine. Writing must carry the Dao. 文以载道. Dao can be anything, can be truth, cosmic logic, spirit, whatever. But it's some kind of a social, political, philosophical totality there. Must carry the Dao. Consumed by a pathological obsession with China, Liang, according to Xia, Liang operates with a utilitarian notion of literature. While he acknowledges the aesthetic power of traditional popular fiction, Liang denigrates traditional popular fiction for propagating immoralities like robbery and lust. Those things are very, very bad. They teach people to behave very, very badly, like 毁淫,毁道, robbery and lust. Right. The new fiction, on the other hand, should take advantage of fiction's aesthetic potentials and recycle them to serve the nobler political and moral purposes, that is, to put them to social use. Liang's view of fiction flies in the face of C.T. Xia's aesthetic taste, right? Xia dismisses Liang's theory as utilitarian, traditional, ideological, and political. In short, it is unaesthetic. Now, Xia goes on to cite positive cases against Liang. One of them is Wang Moxi. This is a very, very prominent critic and literati writer who founded literary magazine 小说林, The Growth of Fiction, in 1907, at the turn of the century. Huang maintained that as an art form, fiction should be aesthetically satisfying rather than a panacea for social problems. The novel would lose its artistic value when pressed into the service of, quote, the state, or the statue of the state, the scriptures of a religion, and the textbooks to be used in school. The moral norms of nation and society, end of quote. C.T. Xia also invokes Wang Guowei, another figure, another very, very important figure in terms of Chinese reception of Western idea of aesthetics, and apply them to literary criticism. To Xia, Wang Guowei upheld the sacred value of aesthetics in his analysis of Cao Xueqin's novel, The Dream of Red Chamber. This is a really a common knowledge, because the Wang is the single most important writer in turning a novel into the symbol of aesthetic study per se, right? Now, Xia's notion of aesthetics, however, is mortgaged to a certain kind of romanticism in the West, to various art for art's sake schools in 19th century Europe and in early modernism, reincarnated in the new criticism in the US with its intrinsic approach to literature. This notion allowed Xia to write his essay against Liang in 1978, still the heyday of the new criticism. When I was in grad school, we still had the tail end of it, right? And then we moved on to post-structuralism deconstruction, right? This aesthetic conceives literary aesthetic experience as an inward realm of pleasurable contemplation and refined taste by sequestering aesthetics from political, social, and moral context, and by upholding literariness to be supreme value. Xia's notion strips aesthetics of its multiple engagement with historical practice and reduces this very, very productive concept, the aesthetic, it's very productive concept, into a fetish, into a metaphysics, in fact. In light of this truncated concept, Raymond Williams points to aesthetics' exclusive emphasis on the subjective sense of activity and the emphasis on the specialized creativity of art. Marked by a narrow focus on art, on visual experience, on the category of the sublime, but not the category of the beautiful, but not the sublime. Beautiful is the seamless, the Grecian urn, right? Grecian urn. The beauty is truth, that sort of thing. So, with all this emphasis, the subjectivist aesthetics, according to Williams, isolates inner sense perception as the basis of art and beauty, stemming from what Williams called the divided modern consciousness that separate culture from society. This aesthetic, this truncated, narrow aesthetic, may express a humanistic impulse against the dominant ideologies of the bourgeois society, but the isolation of the singular sense activity can be rather damaging. I quote Williams here, "For there is something irresistibly displaced and marginal about the now common and limiting phrase, aesthetic considerations." It's very, very narrow. To Williams, the division of labor in the market society compartmentalizes the interconnected human activity on the model of commodity production and specialization, which was the historical context for the emergency of the truncated concept of aesthetics. I'll quote another person, Terry Eagleton, building upon the critique of his teacher, Williams, shows that the crust of aesthetics is the human body. The aesthetic is concerned with the body's sensible and sensuous access to the world. The aesthetic refers to the, quote, the whole region of human perception and sensation, in contrast to conceptual thought and instrumental rationality. Far from elevating art from life, the aesthetic concerns what is bound up with humans' creaturely life. The narrow discourse, the new discourse of aesthetics, engages in the business of affection and aversion, of how the world strikes the body on its sensory surfaces, of that which take the root in the gaze and the gut, And all that arises from the most banal biological insertion into the world as a science that attends to sensuous free particulars. The first chapter of Egerton's book is Free Particulars of the Body. Aesthetics discourse arose in 18th century Germany to address the ways bodily impulses may be groomed, may be educated, cultivated to fit into a new bourgeois social order. Political hegemony could not allow the body's freewheeling particulars and its collective discontents roam freely. A social order must rein in minds and body, by educating and forging docile subjects from within, and by working on the subject's emotion, taste, and sensibility. Aesthetics emerged as a solution to problems of politics. As Friedrich Schiller famously claimed, it is through beauty that we arrive at freedom. Right. Now, this freedom is not autonomous, sort of freewheeling freedom of the individual will. This is really the political freedom. As Hannah Arendt says, what's freedom? Freedom is the very reason that men live in political organization. Freedom is at the heart of the politics. What does the politics want to do? To get people together to live in freedom. Self-rule, that's freedom, right? Political freedom. So the aesthetic is connected with the freedom, but not the freedom that you associated with this, the intrinsic autonomy, self-willing aspect of the aesthetic experience or literariness. On the other hand, if hegemonic power resorts to aesthetics to inscribe social authority on the individual's sense and sensibility, aesthetic may serve emancipatory purposes. By giving allowance to sensation, aesthetics also gives vent to sensuous gratification, and redraw the map of sensuous experience. This emancipatory dimension resonates with Jacques Rancière's concept of the distribution of the sensible. For Rancière, emancipatory social change is both political and aesthetic. Redistribution of the sensible is a political act of pushing the envelope. Aesthetic experience emancipates individuals from the divided modern consciousness and from alienated labor to exercise bodily and mental freedom from the external imperatives. A new affective subject emerges to perform this self-rule and engages in the educational Bildung towards a republic of free personalities, where individuals or community may participate in the politics of the sensible. I'll quote Terry Eagleton. This kind of situation, the republic, a community that involved the participation of the political subject, is the one where obeying no rule, where people were obeying no rules, but those which they gave to themselves. Obeying no rules, but those they gave to themselves. This link between aesthetics and politics is what mostly appealed to Chinese thinkers, like Liang Qicao. Liang Qicao is thinking along this line rather than the other line, right? So you can see the divergence in Chinese reception of one kind of aesthetics over the other. The socially engaged aesthetics is most evident in Cai Yuanpei's educational program. In the drive to replace traditional value, Cai, as the Minister of Education in the First Chinese Republic, it's in the after 1911, put aesthetics on a par with physical, intellectual, and ethical education. school in German aesthetics in Leipzig, Germany from 1908 to 1911. He studied Kant and Hegel, and the most sort of a classic philosophical aesthetics. Tsai became Minister of Education. Tsai showed no signs of modern divided consciousness and betrayed no interest in the depoliticized approach to aesthetics. Instead, aesthetics is to cultivate secular ethical standards and to build an affective and virtuous personality. Tsai applied aesthetics to the national projects of cultural rejuvenation, fostering civic virtue, and the modernization of ethics. This socially engaged aesthetics is absent in the intrinsic literary criticism that we saw in Xia Zhiqing. Although Xia called upon Huang Moxi earlier, we have Huang Moxi and Wang Gui, two most exemplary figures of aesthetics. A closer look at the two writers tell us that the Xia is not reading right, because you look deeply into their text, they are not saying the thing that he wants them to say, right? So a look at these two writers once again, will tell us that these figures of traditional Chinese literati, they are the children, they're figures of literati, right? They have their literati in their blood. Now, what's literati? Literati is deeply committed to the public service. You're not a professional writer or poet. You're deeply committed to public service and the governance of the state. They are no less concerned with the social and political issues when they are dealing with aesthetic issues. Wang Gui's essay, we leave aside the Dream of the Red Chamber, right? We look at Wang Gui's essay, Incidental Remarks on Literature, 文学小言. It offers a very striking case of morally driven aesthetics. Wang defines literature as equal in value and legitimacy to philosophy, yielding to no power, structure, and orthodoxy. This is very independent, right? Autonomous. Like philosophy, literature defies social norms, declares independence, and displays originality. That literature that serves the utilitarian purpose of eating and drinking, gainful interest, is false literature, right? Genuine literature, on the other hand, stems from the disinterested free play of the sovereign spirit, releasing energy, generating cognitive picture of the world, and emotionally compelling representations. This sounds very much like the other side, right? The intrinsic ones. If these remarks sound like affirmation of the truncated aesthetics, Wang claimed in the same breath that while the works of poetic giants like Qu Yuan, Tao Yuanming, and Du Fu are of timeless value, the aesthetic value is to be attributed not to the poet's brilliant verses and poetic genius. Their greatness comes rather from the noble, magnificent personalities. 高尚伟大之人格. It's the content of their character, not the poetic genius that count, right? Wang's essay, 屈原 Spirit of Literature, 屈子文学之精神, suggests an ideal link between aesthetics and political imagination. Wang first distinguished two strands of moral political thought in China. One is imperial, 帝王的, committed to dynastic order. The other is plebeian, individualistic, and reclusive. Right, withdraw into the mountain, reclusive, like Tao Yuanming. The political committed school corresponds to the northern school, which makes for the Tao of poetry. So it's the letter, the writing carry the Tao. This is the mainstream, the Tao of poetry. Taking the moral fabric and political order as a whole, the northern school is interested in representing life in general, not isolated individual life, but but one embedded in the family, the state, and society. Now, this is a very Confucian line of thinking, right? This Confucian school invariably addresses the space between emperor and subjects, father and son, and husband and wife. That's Northern school. In contrast, the Southern school of poetics, represented by Taoist spirited poets with reclusive band. They always want to go to the mountain, right, to meditate, right, tend to be more imaginative, more spontaneous, and less committed. As the fanciful, authentic expression of a child, works of Southern poets are less constrained by conventions. Their poems are more enjoyable and refined in poetic sentiment and imagery, or Southern poets. Now, these two schools represent the political and aesthetic poles, if you like, only to be reconciled by Wang Guowei in his conclusion. The Northern school worked within the political order in the hopes of changing the old society. It's not just stagnant within. This does not mean that Northern school are merely establishment writers, patronized by the powerful officials. They work within the system, but they're not complicit, right? Along the line of who pays the piper called the tune, right? This does not work that way, right? They possess a strong will and courage, Wang notes, and keeping faith with their responsibility as a guardian of moral ideas. They combated society even though they met with responsibility. Even though they get paid for society, the government, they still combated society, right? On the other hand, the Southern poets did not simply indulge in a poetic fantasy, detached as they are from the system and nonchalant. The Southern poets are still trying to envision and create a new social order. Blocked by hostility from the dominant power, the Southern poet school expressed its ideas and found consolation, solace, in the utopian enclave of nature and reclusive refuges. This escapist aesthetic gesture, however, does not rule out its imaginary identification with the deferred, rectified. They want to see the political order rectified, right? Rectified. Rectified is a very, really loaded word because in later Maoist aesthetics, rectification is 整风, right? Really played right into the tradition of working from inside to change, right? Inside culturally, aesthetically to change the aesthetic pattern that underlies the political order, right? Rectify. So the Southern poets, in spite of their detachment, is trying to project a vision of society in image rather than in reality, because they're out, right? So but they create the image. Wang claims that both schools have reformist motivations, indeed harbor ardent yearning to rectify the degenerate, unjust social political order. The North tries to realize political ideas in practice, struggling or negotiating and often compromising with the system, right? The South withdraw and drop out of the system to elaborate on its dreams on the sidelines, on the margins, right? Now, between these political and aesthetic poles, Jian, this is the exemplary figure for Wang Guowei in his reading of Jian. Jian comes to the fore as a figure that interweaves these two schools, combining political commitment with aesthetic accomplishment. Although Jian was from the South, he imbibed the ideas and poetics of the North, the mainstream, and admired the sage king as the moral political exemplar in the Confucian tradition. Although Jian was indeed an establishment poet, he's in the service of the court, right? But he suffered injury and exile, humiliation, again and again. For all that, he kept his commitment to a vision of ideal political order. And this order is not to be equated with existing power relations, not to be equated with his loyalty to the specific king or something. His writings about some imagined utopian social order. On the other hand, Jian's poetry not only exhibits all the poetic brilliance and imaginativeness, also has all the southern flavor, extremely aesthetic, extremely refined and accomplished. Our next example, the counterexample for Xi Tixia is Huang Moxi, the founder of the magazine. Huang was cited as a good example. Huang deploys the fact that in the past, fiction had been denigrated as being low taste and immoral, where contemporary critics elevated fiction to a panacea for social malaise, an instrument for enlightening the population. Against this utilitarian trend, Huang asserts that the novel is a mode of literature concerned with aesthetic forms and should not be compared to visual art, music, and performance. In his article, Incidental Words About the Novel, Huang makes a case for the novel's accessibility and appeal to the educated and uneducated alike, and its attractions to women and children by holding up a mirror to their own everyday life. Although the novel is removed from the prevalent discourse of statecraft or essays of civil service examination, it nevertheless creates a composite, multifaceted vernacular that incorporates public moral discourse, mixing literary language with folklores, vulgar street talks, gossip in women's quarters, and woodcutters' songs and sayings. He's talking about the element of vernacular in the new novel as extremely accessible, popular, and aesthetically appealing. He's talking about the sense. So all these together serve as a sumptuous material for the palate. See the sensuous dimension to the palate of the reader. It tastes good, right? Like food. So much for the aesthetic. But when it comes to characterization in the novel, morality comes up once again. While viewing the novel Water Margin, this is a story about the outlaw community. It's like the Chinese Robin Hood, right? Viewing the novel Water Margin to be aesthetically compelling, Huang claimed that it is purely socialist spirited, 纯是社会主义精神. Together, 108 warriors to form a small society and run it in an egalitarian spirit is unprecedented in Chinese history, he said. Mount Liang is the mountain that they retreated into. They formed a community there. Mount Liang, Liangshan, is a utopian society governed by socialist principles, whereby each and every talent has its own place, its own use. The Zhongyi Tang, the Loyalty and Righteousness Hall, this is, from present perspective, maybe the most rotten feudal thing, but for Huang, it's very, very, very inspirational. This hall, public hall, embodies the virtue intrinsic to a just community. Exerting oneself to the utmost for the social good is called zhong, loyalty, and practicing this virtue is called yi, righteousness. Thus, this self-sacrifice is a far cry from the dumb loyalty of unreflected persons. Loyalty is not it's a dumb loyalty of unreflected person, like slave. The slogan of this outlaw community is carry out the Tao of heaven, 替天行道, which enjoins the warriors to uphold the principle of justice without fear of self-sacrifice. Now, influenced by anarcho-socialist thought, which was very, very widespread from Russia, from France from Japan, is everywhere at that juncture in modern Chinese history, is influenced by that anarchist and socialist thought, small community, right? People self-rule without government, this sort of thing. Wang deploys a political and moral criteria to justify the aesthetic appeal of the characters inside the story. Song Jiang is the main character. The leader of the whole outlaw community is a Da Xia, is a grand knight errant. It's not a small knight errant for like against to practice martial art for personal vendetta. It's not the kind of thing. It's for great things. Da Xia. So Song Jiang, so an ugly, swarthy fellow of short stature, homeless and always on the run. Song has none of the signs of your regular noble, magnificent hero. Yet the warriors and ordinary people flock to him, and are ready to die for him. Song is able to win the hearts and minds of his followers by displaying wisdom and virtue much superior to that of local people in high places. He's much more qualified to lead and govern than emperors and local officials, Huang points out. The outlaw's rebellion is read by Huang as an affirmation of human rights and the rejection of tyranny. Right? His word is the 重人权, emphasis on human rights, 义专制, to put down, to devalue tyranny. The rights of powerlessness, he uphold the rights, they uphold the rights, the powerlessness and disadvantaged against oppression of powerful tyranny. Huang distinguishes two kinds of aesthetically exciting episodes. That Wu Song is one of the warrior that killed tiger with his fist. Right? With his physique and raw prowess, he kills a tiger. Is really dramatic and aesthetic. It's very powerful, but it is not as compelling and extraordinary as when he tries to kill a dog unleashed by a local bully to bully some of his buddies. Right? This is much more aesthetic because of its upholding justice. Right? The aesthetic portrayal of the characters depends as much upon the appeal of virtue as on the unheroic yet legitimate pursuit of equal rights to food. They are scrambling for food, but the local bullies just release dogs to attack them, right? But they try to fight off the dogs. So this is really it's a kind of unheroic but legitimate pursuit of equal rights to food, fairness, and personal dignity. So in our context, another example is very helpful. Lucien was aware of the aesthetic uselessness and disinterestedness exposed to all kinds of Western ideas. He was educated in Japan. Right? For him, literature does not generate wealth as commerce and industry and does not help with our daily survival. Yet for all its uselessness, literature has the power to launch humanity on the way to fulfillment. Citing British critic Dalton, Lucien links the pleasure of literature to the energizing effect experienced by the swimmer in the ocean. Seeing a boundless ocean, boundless horizon open before him, the swimmer breasts the waves and comes forth at the end of the swim feeling physically and spiritually rejuvenated. Though the sea is but a mass of surging waves and churning water, devoid of the emotion, which has never uttered a maximum or moral pronouncement. Nevertheless, the physical and mental well-being of the swimmer has been immensely enhanced by the swim. Though inferior to science in the power of investigating nature, literature has an edge over the latter in its ability to reveal the subtler truth and human meanings that elude scientific logic. Evoking Matthew Arnold's argument of culture as the key to political order, Lucien reclaims the role of literature as offering instructions beneficial to human life and articulating vital moral qualities, such as self-awareness, courage, and enterprising spirit, and self-development. In literature, Lucien envisioned a scenario of the tempting of the physical body, along with the formation of a new subjectivity, propelled by the urgent need to address and repair the broken body politic. This is the national crisis, the downfall of the traditional dynasty, and the new things are not born yet. Right? It's really in a crisis. So he used literature to repair the broken body politic, although he's working on the physical body. Literature seeks to forge ethical bonds by integrating fragmented individual bodies into a robust and social political body. The emotional effect of poetry is related to an image of innate but public morality, which accords with the sharing of moral teaching and enlightenment. You look at this quote, the next quote. This is a very, very interesting quote. They're both innate and in and out, inside and outside, right? Poets are indeed the disruptors of man's heart, for every human mind, every human heart contains poetry within it. And when a poet has written a poem, it does not belong to him exclusively, but to whoever can understand it in their hearts. Poets say these things for them. As when a musician plucks a note, a response comes immediately from the heartstring of the audience. This sounds very much like the quintessential Chinese poetics about the origin of poetry. But something interesting comes up in the end of this. A response comes immediately from the heartstring of the audience, and the note reverberates throughout the caverns of soul, causing men of feeling to look up, inspired as though they were gazing at some new dawn ablaze with light that has the power to strengthen, ennoble, and enlighten. In traditional poetics, you don't have this kind of public empowerment or ennobling or enlightenment. Note that sense. It's really very private, right? Private. So rather than supplying physical strength and thrill of excitement, poetry is to energize and uplift readers with moral sentiment and strength. In such rethinking, I conclude, rethinking by three figures. They are all touted as aesthetic thinkers of literature, but it turned out they are not quite. They are aesthetic, but it's really driven by some other things. In such rethinking, literature is by no means a handmaiden of the established moral orthodoxy and a vehicle in the service of political power. So literature is no longer subordinated to political power. Rather than isolating literature as autonomous and disinterested, socially engaged thinkers like Lucien and Wang entangle literature further and deeper into the contextual matrix of social, moral, and political issues. They get into deeper and deeper in the dirty water of history, rather than a very, very pure, intrinsic notion of literature from art for psych. They get it more and more deeper and further into that. Both external and internal to literature, political and moral considerations suggest that literature should work towards nurturing noble sentiments and enlightenment so as to accomplish the political rejuvenation of the Chinese people. They worry about China still. Thank you very much.
I believe that our speaker will entertain questions, and I see a question already.
Thank you very much. Certainly I've learned a lot in a short time. I want to ask you, I mean, this is a constellation that we, I mean, historical observers, have seen in the 20th century. So a certain body of philosophical, theoretical text and position migrates and then produces a resonance in an environment that comes from completely different premises. I mean, I could ask the question, which I won't because it's been asked too much. I mean, is there an object really equivalent to literature and Chinese culture and so forth? And so what I wanted to ask really is about the productivity of that reception. Yeah? I mean, whenever you were going to the Western side, this was very well done and recognizable. There's certain positions, I mean, that you can identify as you did in German idealism and so forth and so forth. But would you say that in that process of reception, is there any position, any philosophical point, any argument that has emerged that it would be important for Western culture to receive? Or is it just playing through the repertoire of Western ideas and coming to different distributions?
Now this is quite a question, and they do come to when they come to the Western aesthetics, they have their baggage right behind them. The baggage, the premise that you mentioned, the premise is really the letters, art and letters, are part of the organic whole of the social order. This is the ultimate baggage, because any writing that matters at all, right, has to have that the sort of a use, has the social and political use. This is the so that when they come to Western texts, they resonate with the other part, the part of the aesthetics that is sort of claimed by Schiller, right? But do they create something new out of it, right? I think this is the way question is that do they create something new out of it? Something new. I think that they are also very, very, very interested in the aesthetic part. I think the combination of the aesthetics and politics in the three writers are much stronger than what you find. I mean, somehow these two can be reconciled in some way. Much more radical than what you find in some German writers, or in Matthew Arnold, in Matthew Arnold, or some the idea that somehow literature should be harnessed to some art should be harnessed to some sort of grandiose sort of social order, or even the critique social order, or living criticism of society, because they come from another premise. Another premise is that the art and poetry is the expression of the human heart, right? So they're extremely interested in the formal features. I think that on that account, they seem to go a little bit further, and somehow they harbor the sort of aspiration that these two poles, seemingly incompatible, can be reconciled, right?
But I mean, if I understand you correctly, you'd say that it's rather a difference by degree.
That by degree.
You find similar positions, but they're more radical.
Yeah.
Of course, in being more radical, in going further, you may find, philosophically speaking, certain insights that the Western debates have not generated. But there's nothing, you'd say that's profoundly different, really.
Profoundly different, really, not really much. I don't think there's anything that come out right out of blue from this kind of argument. Right? It's really in the Western, some of the Western ideas you can find it actually the echoes of it in a formal aesthetic way, and in the Western sort of Republican communitarian aesthetics you can find it some other way in China. But the combination, configuration will be a degree of difference. You know. And it's degrees. I mean, may be attributed to sort of a different kind of a attempt to modernize China, right? China's sort of advanced. China sort of embrace of modern, right? China's embrace modern is not just the straightforward, like you hug modern. It really has a lot of baggage, and it really sort of shaped their attitude in embracing the modern. Yes, yeah.
I'm afraid it will be a too specific question, but I have a question about Lucien. Because as far as I know, Lucien abandoned fiction writing and started writing only political essays, Jian, which are regarded as too political or not aesthetic and not literary. And yeah, so just 20 years after he abandoned medical study and decided to become a writer. So how can we understand this kind of literary conversion in terms of the tension between aesthetics and politics?
Yeah, his essays, 杂文, seem to be to the political polemics, right? Just polemics, sort of arguing some issue over some issues with his adversaries, right? This question is almost unsolved in Chinese literary criticism, right? People don't know why he changed this way, just running out of steam maybe in creativity. My feeling about this, my feelings about that he's become extremely unsure about the importance of literature, right, in making a difference in society. It's extremely after just this it's a fiction writing after his Wild Grass. I have theory about Wild Grass. Wild Grass is already you have like self-deconstructive kind of tendency to undercut its own writing again and again. So writing is not transparent. It's not a duplication or it's not imitation life. The kind of sort of real the power of language to represent reality is sort of is already in question, very much in question. So he became more and more unsure about the power of literature to make a difference, to intervene in social life, right? But writing an image, writing a character, right? Intervene, even though he's very popular on that account. So he kind of wants to have direct sort of confrontation with all those people that did not agree with. I think that may be the. But the language is the thing. It's the power of the language. A lot of people have looked at this kind of the loss of faith in a language to represent reality and to write a narrative about social change or some social or the suffering or plight of the people. So you turn to the Wild Grass. That is already a turning point. Wild Grass is really broken. All the verse, broken verse, verse poem verse, that sort of thing. Then he moves on to the more direct confrontation with essays. Yeah. Yes.
I had a question. My question has to do with rewriting modern Chinese literary history. So in a way, the modern Chinese history that is embedded in national salvation, nation building, the discourse of that made the marriage between aesthetics and politics almost an imperative. And that seems to me the driving logic behind the writing of modern Chinese literary history. And I think the literary critic you draw from Xia Zhiqing, in a way, his book is a kind of attempt to rewrite modern Chinese literary history by claiming the kind of writers that fall outside of that imperative, that is the marriage between aesthetics and politics. For example, the most important writer he recuperates is Shen Congwen.
Yeah.
And so even though the logic is about the marriage and aesthetics and politics, we as contemporary literary critics, how do we rewrite a kind of modern Chinese literary history that intervenes in that hegemonic discourse that is national salvation and consequently the marriage of an aesthetic and politics, how to recuperate alternative literary movements such as, say, 新感觉派, new sensational movement, or writers like popular, fiction writers, and also like Lin Yutang. So how to incorporate them into the literary map in order to, on the one hand, acknowledge the map between the marriage between aesthetics and politics. On the other hand, write a kind of literary history that brings back the alternatives.
Yeah, okay, that's very, very good. Because first, which school, which trend is hegemonic? Like 夏志清, this intrinsic criticism is becoming the hegemonic now, right? It's not the Liang Qicao, the kind of literature to salvation of people. That's not the hegemonic. In the last 30 years, 夏志清is the hegemonic. Because it's the modernist liberal Western idea about aesthetics, right? Aesthetics is a sort of a protection of private space against any kind of a social connection, right? Right. That's the hegemonic, but the salvation thesis is not the hegemonic. It was, but it was in a way that it's completely sort of just used literature as a tool. That's the earlier, previous hegemonic mode of thinking. There's no aesthetic in it. So already in my reading, I'm trying to bring aesthetic into the earlier hegemonic, right? First, aesthetic into the earlier hegemonic, and in talking about the essays, the people you talk about, like Shen Chongwen and the cosmopolitan writer, they are held as the example of the sort of individualistic sort of contemplation, that kind of aesthetics. I mean, what we can do is to bring them back to more. I mean, the dirty word of history. They are not so pure anymore, right? Bring them back a little bit because they're going way down that line, right? Down that road. It's extremely effective. This is just the private. This is just the freewheeling space, right? Intrinsic. You have all these. Shen Chongwen actually is not, of course not. So no worries about big questions all the time. Shen Chongwen cannot be read in that very, very limited, narrow way, right? So you see that there are several options here, right? Options. The Xia Zhiqing actually is way down the line. It's bringing back to connect with the political dirty water of history again. Connect back. But in the old hegemonic line is way too. It's over political. Over political in the sense that political is no longer my understanding of political. It's just really it's policing, right? In the Hang Ziye sense, it's because politics is not policing. It's not administration. It's not the power relation. Politics here is you intervene into this political cultural sphere. Intervene, and you have a lot of people participating in making speeches, standing up, making speeches. You don't want to drop out into the enclave of just writing about poetry, express yourself. You want to express yourself and participate in this discussion of how to write a narrative of all the people, right? Yes. Yeah.
So I have a question that's also sort of from the West, but not as far west as Zep's question. So this is a question kind of as a Russianist. I mean, first of all, I just wanted to say I'm very, very sympathetic to your argument because I find in working with Russian poetry of the same early 20th century period that the people who are seen as apolitical are actually very political. The poets, the symbolists and acmeists and sort of modernists who, neo-romantics who seem to us to kind of, they're so fun to read with a new critical kind of lens, and so we believe them to be new critics, but they're not. They were revolutionaries. They were getting arrested.
Yes, that's
they were
right.
Very political.
Right. Really.
You know, too political for their own good, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So now that I've expressed my sympathy, I have a question, which is, in this Russian modernist stuff, poetry especially, you see very often some of the same images that appeared in your in the text that you cite, and specifically images of the ocean and the sun, the ocean and the dawn. Those are, of course, images that fascinate the Romantics as well, right? In the early 19th century, and then you see them in the early 20th century Russian material. You see them come back, and whereas in the 19th century material, I think, very broadly generalizing, the ocean and the sun represent some big thing that is not under human power, or maybe it's the power of a single person, kind of a monarch, some one very powerful thing. Whereas when it reappears in the early 20th century material, I think it's very often linked to the masses or the crowd or sort of people as a whole. You know, the ocean or floods are so often ways in Russian poetry of the sort of revolutionary period. They're ways of talking about lots of people and the potential power of a crowd. And I think with the sun, it's a similar thing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about. I guess I have two questions. First, how do you think these images of kind of the natural world outside of the individual human body function in the sort of politically engaged context that you've described? And then my other question is this as in the Russian material that it's a reclaiming of some earlier or a reworking of an earlier way of talking about the sun, the ocean, the natural world?
Yeah, the sun and the ocean, the natural world, is very much present. It's really the major themes in classical Chinese poetry. But here it's used very, very differently, right? Very, very differently. It's used politically in Lucien here, politically in a way that it follows the May 4th iconoclastic tendency, right, to because for these young revolutionary writers, the Chinese culture has been weighed down, being dragged by conventions, by orthodoxy, structures, or rituals, right? It's very, very unnatural in a Husserlian sense. Very, very unnatural. Society, civilization. It's like heavy iron house in Lucien. It's really iron house, right? It's really shackle, right? So you call upon some kind of primordial natural forces. In addition to this natural thing, there's also this idea that China is the sick man of East Asia, right? The whole Chinese political body, the sick man of East Asia. So it's become sort of weakened by the heavy convention, civilization, rules, right? Elaborate, right? So they call upon natural forces in a way that's extremely different from the way the classical sort of a private expression as the poets they call upon nature. Nature for them is it's peaceful, right? It's very peaceful. But here it's really very violent. It almost has this sublime quality there, right? It's very, very violent. And everybody can participate in this kind of surging tides and the sun on this. So this is political use of it. It really taps into this the revolutionary iconoclastic, the anti-feudal, anti-conventional that sentiment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I want to go back to the title of the talk. You mentioned a geographical dimension of the Western aesthetics and Chinese literature, and it's not really a question. It's I want to invite you to talk more on the temporal dimension of the tradition and modern, or old and new. When you say aesthetics and politics, what's the temporal dimension in each of these two categories?
Okay.
That's the first one. And the second one is about genre. You mentioned poetry and novels, and left out Chinese theater. And I want to hear a little bit more your comments on the traditional theater's transformation into the modern, and this genre's marriage of our effort to marry politics and aesthetics, but not to be manipulated by both elements.
Okay. The first question about temporal, interesting because there is this this notion that Chinese modern appropriation of Western ideas actually happened in about 1 or 2 decades, and absorbed like maybe 3 centuries or 3 centuries worth of modern ideas in 1 decade or 2 decades, like what they said about China in the last 3 decades. They said it compressed the whole Western modernity into 3 decades. So you have really a mixture of temporalities in 1 decade. But the interesting thing is here is that they do have modern, in Liang Jichao's time and in early 2030s, they do have all these modernist intrinsic ideas available, but they don't find it to their own taste. They go for those things that seem to help there to imagine a new social order, to articulate their desire to make change. So they go for those things. So you see the temporality, you collapse all this together, but they don't go for those, and they would rather pick up. What's the second question?
The genre of Chinese theater as part of the Chinese
Chinese theater, how Chinese theater. I think Chinese theater plays into this kind of a framework even better because it really, it's much more participatory. It is it's a public art, right? And it's most effective weapon and space for people to put their to make a speech, to act out their sentiment and discontents, right? So it's much more useful than poetry. In fact, when you look at Lucien's this kind of a scenario for poetic enlightenment as well as mobilization, there's some kind of mobilization here, mobilization of the masses here. I think works much better than theater. Okay, this kind of scenario, right? Much better than theater. Okay, yeah.
Back to the general questions. And theater is, of course, a very classical form of art, which is very different from the novel, and often it's associated with modernity. So as we can see in Liang Qichao's advocation for new fiction, basically he's advancing a new genre of the novel that's distinguished from the traditional xiaoshuo in Chinese sense. But I'm interested in, okay, Lucien has also mentioned different practice of writing essays, essays, fictions, and here he's doing romantic poetry as a national summation. And I'm interested in the kind of critics advanced by Wang or Liang Qichao against the pre-existing narrative process. So if Wang criticized that kind of butterfly fiction, I think he's doing that both in a formal way, and the target of his criticism is also directed at the content. And when Liang Qichao is advocating kind of new fiction, he is not only advancing notion of fiction for new content, but also he himself practicing writing some new fiction in a very formal and aesthetic way.
Yeah.
But that practice turned out to be a kind of fiasco. Because that is not aesthetically appealing enough for the readership. So I'm interested in the notion of genre and its entanglement with this discussion of politicizing aesthetics and how their awareness of generic distinction reflect a kind of notion of aesthetic.
Yeah, the Huang and Liang, they are, as I said, that they are quite interested in the formal and the narrative powers of the, all come under the name of aesthetics. But aesthetics here, the notion of what is the aesthetic features is really a very tricky question, right? how they of course trash the content, but they don't trash the way the novel is written, right?
For some of the
Yeah,
novels, the
yeah.
plot gets repeated. You
Yeah,
always get
yeah,
gifted.
yeah. This is really very, very important issue. Now, Liang Qisao actually picked up four things about the novel's emotive powers. Four things that you have to provoke, you have to immerse, you have to xun, right? It's just smoked like, and then you have to hit on your head, right? Four kind of things. They are all very, very aesthetic, purely aesthetic, without content, because aesthetic can be used for. This can be used for the Buddhist teaching, right? Because basically all the Buddhist items, right? The way the Buddhist master tried to bring up the disciple, they use that all kind of ways, right? Very, very slow, but suddenly you beat up this person, hit on the head, right? The novel can do that, like a Buddhist master, right? Those are really aesthetic features. And Huang Wuxi actually also looks at that. I talked about the vernacular, right? He remarks about how vernacular is formed. It's very colorful and accessible to everybody, like children and women, uneducated, right? Illiterate people can really relate to it, right? It's really the. So I think they really want to identify some aesthetic features. And try to bring them to their message, right? Somehow repackage their message in terms of all those forms. On the other hand, your question about somehow Liang Qisao experiment with novel writing and then so fail miserably, right? This is a really interesting question because is there a way of naming some kind of classical features of a work, the timeless feature of the work, that appeal to all people in all time? That would let's say, would you say that Kafka's stories are aesthetic? Right. When he wrote it, I mean, nobody would read it. Right. Even James Joyce, I would not say it's aesthetic. Right. Shakespeare was not aesthetic. Right. The idea of aesthetic is really is historical. Depends on historical sentiment and the whole intellectual climate. Shakespeare was not aesthetic at all. Was criticized thoroughly criticized by the people, by French classists, right? And James Joyce, and so it's very hard to say that revolutionary novels they're unaesthetic. They were very, very aesthetic for a lot of people, right? So it depends on, you have to look at the historical condition, the whole soil for the idea, how this come about, how this idea came to being in a certain period of time. James Joyce, I mean, for our students, our aesthetic exemplars do not work with our students at all. They will look at all this, kind of sort of images from online. Right? I find it very hard to teach aesthetic classics, to sell the idea of aesthetic to anybody. I mean, in a introduction classroom, right? Introductory to
We have one last question.
Thank you. So I'm interested in the, say, diffusion of European works around the world. So I was wondering, and I know so very little about Chinese literature, so I was wondering if you could talk about what specific authors or works were maybe resonant with the authors you spoke of today.
Resonant spoke today. Which side are you on? Are you on the intrinsic side or on the politically engaged side? Both sides. Yeah, this is the very the big issue here. Of course, when you move to the intrinsic side, you have the whole school of literary new criticism, and also in Britain, right? You have those in the late 19th century, early 10th, modernist critics and novelists. They will like to isolate. Walter Pater aesthetics will be a very, very good, very interesting one. Walter Pater aesthetics. You read. I suggest that you read Terry Egerton's book, The Ideology of Aesthetics. Right. It has plays both sides. To have that. And he's trying to bring the aesthetic out of the closet. Really out of the closet, right? The whole book is really saying that it's not good, right? Because it's really shut into the closet. It's a skeleton in the closet. Just bring it out, open, right? So they have a lot of authors, philosophers, and literary critics that he discussed, but not really authors. He does not talk about authors. Yeah. The authors, I would say in the British literature, I'm more familiar. I think I'm more familiar with also with some American literature. American literature in the 30s, I like those not Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein is this art for art's sake, but the other modernists. John Steinbeck, Whitman, Walt Whitman, and I like those transcendentalists, American authors, yeah, and also the Western literature, also the Russian Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky is very morally driven. Tolstoy, and also the Russian revolutionary writers, I like them too. Yeah.
Civil pose.
Yeah. And the authors, I mean, aesthetic Chernyshevsky, it's also influenced the Chinese a lot, right?
Let us thank our speaker.
Thank you.